Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the USAriadna Ranger Force. In this video, we're talking about who USAriadna are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, there are many weaknesses, and general factional identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through their roster and talk about some of those profiles that showcase that identity. Now, firstly, big thanks to channel supporter Jacob Hawkins, who made the request for this video. In particular, Jacob is interested in hearing about what we might be able to do to have some success with USAriadna in N5. And I think that question is both interesting but also very telling, because we will be talking about why and how USAriadna are a challenging faction to play in this edition, and then turning our mind to, okay, what can we do to overcome this? How can we achieve some success with this faction in this edition? What are the edges we might be able to obtain in list construction, and how might we be able to leverage those in a game to get some wins? And so that segues, I think, quite neatly into talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the faction. But we are going to start with the weaknesses and limitations of USAriadna first, because I think that's necessary to kind of paint the picture of what we're up against here, and then start talking about how we might go about overcoming it. Now, there are a number of things to talk about when we talk about USAriadna and Ariadna generally, but we'll start with probably the biggest one and then talk through a few of the secondary limitations of the faction. Because the bigger one is kind of systemic. It is the Ariadna problem. Now, I think people are noticing this quite a lot in N5, but it's actually something that has been a long time in materializing. Edition changes from N3 to N4 and then from N4 to N5 have had a cumulative effect on Ariadna generally, because the wheelhouse of Ariadna, their faction design kind of overall, is lower technology, limited stuff like multi-wound heavy infantry and tactical armored gears, much more of a focus on the individual, baseline kind of human fighting a gritty, guts and determination and human spirit kind of war against technologically superior, terrifying in some cases, foes. And that is very compelling from a narrative perspective, but it means that the design of the faction is very much around single wound, regular kind of infantries that are generally, these are normal people. These are normal people without massive technological advantages. Now, from a game balance perspective, what that means is that Ariadna mostly has cheaper single wound infantry, non-hackable usually, and with access to the kind of skills that you can reasonably expect a regular human with no technological advantages in Infinity to have, but that means, by and large, cheaper faction units. And that is something that has become actually, weirdly, less and less valuable over time. Now, the big change occurred in N3 to N4 with the introduction of Tactical Window. The fact that USAriadna could field many cheap and efficient troops was kind of removed in N3 to N4 because every faction was playing with the same troop count. But throughout N4, there were still ways and means that Ariadna could leverage certain strengths that they had in order to win games. There were some pieces in USAriadna that, despite everything, were still high watermark game power elements, bear pods for example, but there were many pieces in Ariadna at large in N4 that was strong enough to carry the faction through to multiple victories. But the fundamental tension of Ariadnan faction design with the 15 trooper limit was still something that existed and had to be contended with. The rebalances from N4 to N5 have exacerbated the problem further, because the beneficiaries of all of the rebalances in N4 to N5 have been things that USAriadna doesn't really possess. Things like hackable heavy infantry and tactical armored gears, and some of the more interesting characters. There are classes of troop types in Infinity that have received, generally speaking, blanket buffs, and USAriadna in particular, but Ariadna at large, have kind of just not been the recipients of almost any of those. On top of that, some of those showcase pieces that USAriadna and Ariadna at large had that allowed them to compete have been pretty aggressively nerfed, obviously in response to playtester feedback. People who have played Infinity and N4 and gone, man, bear pods are fucking cooked. The Unknown Ranger is fucking cooked. Let's get that stuff nerfed. Perfectly reasonably in a vacuum, those were very powerful profiles, but with those profiles having been nerfed in N5, and with the entire game around them getting stronger, there is a position now where Ariadna is very much kind of struggling. Not unplayable, but they are one of the more difficult factions at large. All of the Ariadnan factions are generally among the more difficult factions to play and win with. And then, in the context of the general Ariadna problem, USAriadna are the weakest of the Ariadnan factions, and that's for a number of reasons. The first is just that the faction roster is tiny. There are only 21 units in USAriadna. I did a quick look through Army before recording, and just at a glance, the next smallest faction I could find was Shazvasti, which is almost 50% larger than USAriadna. And in that environment, you just have fewer units. You have less roster diversity, you have less to work with, you have less overall chance of having some bangers in there that you can really use to win a game with. On top of that, there are just a bunch of limitations baked into USAriadna especially. This is a low ballistic skill faction. Not middling, low ballistic skill. There is just nothing in the entire faction that has good ballistic skill. 12 is going to be common. On top of that, we have low access to multi-wound models, we have low access to extra order mechanics, and we have basically no info war. And while those aren't necessarily the most important things in the game, are definitely all very important things to have, and we lack them in this faction. And so that paints overall a pretty bleak picture of playing USAriadna, especially competitively, but even in casual play. Alright, we are starting from a difficult spot here. How, therefore, do we answer the question of how to succeed with USAriadna in N5? And in response to that, there are a couple of things to consider. The first I'm going to put forward is just to make kind of a philosophical point, and that is that success means different things to different people. And this kind of brings us to the idea of a challenge faction, of a faction that is inherently challenging to play. I do not actually subscribe to the idea that ideal game balance sees every faction having an exactly 50% win rate. Now, I do think that in general, you particularly don't want very high outliers, like outliers on the upper region. You don't want 60 and 70% win rate factions. Those are a problem because people who really like winning will gravitate to those, and that will exacerbate that problem and very quickly spiral. But as long as the upper bounds of win rates in factions kind of generally is at about reasonable 55%, it is okay to have factions in a game that are challenging to play. Especially in a game with as many factions as Infinity, it is alright to have the occasional 40% win rate faction, because those factions offer a few things. The first is that they are very challenging to play, and some people will appreciate that just to see if they can take that challenge on. On top of that, for some other people who want to play but do not respond well to competitive pressure, playing a faction that they kind of know they are going to lose with gives them a psychological escape valve that lets them tell themselves that the losses are not important because they were playing Druze in N3 or USAriadna in N5. And of course it's going to be difficult. That's okay. They don't have to worry about the fact that they lose. That actually plays a very valuable role in the game for some people. And then finally, and kind of uniquely to Infinity, because Infinity is such a skill expression game, ultimately, how you play a faction is usually going to be more important than how mechanically strong the faction is. Infinity enables Dark Horse play more than any other wargame I have ever played. The possibility space for an individual turn in Infinity is so many orders of magnitude larger than any other wargame thanks to the order system, and the complexity of tables, and the way that dice can force you to change plan mid-turn, like etc. There are so many things that go into thinking about Infinity that experience and learning and understanding how your faction works and understanding how your opponent's factions work all adds up to so much more than the necessary mechanical power of the faction that you play, that it is actually possible for someone who wants to pick up and learn a challenging faction and leverage that Dark Horse advantage to get wins. If you play a lot of USAriadna, then you go to an event that's out of town, you will be playing against people who are not used to playing against USAriadna, because USAriadna is not a common faction because it's not particularly powerful. It is a known challenge faction. And that means that while your opponent might kind of have the knowledge to understand intellectually what the tools you have access to are, they are not going to know your play patterns or be familiar with how your faction plays in the way that they might be for a more common army. And so when we're thinking about how to succeed with USAriadna, we want to probably filter our definition of success through the idea that this is a challenge faction, right? USAriadna is challenging to play, And so success here is going to either mean getting any wins at all, fantastic, you won a game with USAriadna, good work, or you are going to put that work in and learn how to play this faction, and then leverage the fact that it is going to be fundamentally unfamiliar to many of the opponents that you will play against, say in competitive events. Okay, that's kind of the big high-level philosophical thought. That's very nice. How about some mechanical stuff that we can possibly use, Rob? No worries, I got you on that as well. Now, firstly, despite the fact that yes, our ballistic skill is low, yes, we've got limited access to visibility modifiers on our gunfighting pieces, etc., this is still a faction that has access to a lot of units that are at about the 20-point mark, but which can be relied upon to do work in a game. This is something we're actually going to particularly look at when we get to the sample list at the end of this video. It is going to be making an absolute ton of use of those kind of like 20-ish point pieces. And if we think about how a 300-point list breaks down into 15 troops, one of the genuine advantages you have when you are making lots of use of approximately 20-point models is that you can have 15 units in a list that are 20-point models. If you have 15 20-point pieces, that's 300 points. And if you have 15 models in a list, all of which can potentially be used to prosecute an offensive, do the mission, and win the game, it is very, very hard to knock you out of the game as you play. Right? Everyone has seen this playing against something like a Pan-Oceanian player with a flagship tag, and then something goes wrong, and an Ariadna and AP Spitfire kills a Jotun in a single turn, which can absolutely happen. And that's it. That just toilet bowls the game for the person who spent 90 odd points on their flagship piece. You are immune to that in USAriadna. There is no piece that you can lose in this faction that toilet bowls the game because you have 14 other pieces in a list that can be used to continue to prosecute your attacks and potentially win. That's actually really important, and in the context of you have to learn how to play this faction and learn how they are different and learn how to leverage them and leverage that dark horse advantage, the fact that you can theoretically fight to the last man is an important advantage. Now, that is helped out further by the fact that you can make lots of use of 2- and 3-person fire teams in this faction. We can combine those 20-point average piece elements, we can put them in duos, we can get that special die in active and ARO, and just further force multiply like the entire army doing that. Having access to good duo and Haris options is one of those fundamental things that is really good to have in N5, and we have it here, thank goodness. Next up, for all that we have low ballistic skill and limited access to visual modifiers and limited access to multi-wound, we do, at least in this faction, have a lot of armor 3 pieces. Like, you can build an army that is mostly armor 3, and while that is something that doesn't necessarily feels like it matters too often in individual face-to-face roles, when you have a saturation of at least okay armor, yes, it does tend to add up. If your opponent is coming at you with a Red Fury, the fact that all of your gunfighters have at least decent armor is kind of meaningful, and having it across an entire army means that even though we don't have almost any multi-wound models in this faction, we can at least be expected to go a few rounds against gunfighting at some point during the game. Now, any individual gunfight, yes, you might take a wound and lose a piece, but the many gunfights you will have over the course of a game of Infinity, the armor 3 will add up over the course of that game. Its effect will be cumulative, and while its effect is not the same as having both armor 3 and multi-wound models, which is something we would see on many other factions, it's not nothing. And then finally, for all that I have made a bit of a point about how this is a faction that has a lot of mechanical weakness baked into it, there are still like serviceable and good units in this faction. I have plenty of good things to say about Desperados and Devil Dogs and Foxtrots, etc., and we'll be talking through those pieces when we get to the army section. And so with that, and on that note, with the big caveat that USAriadna is a hard faction to play, it is not a faction I would recommend to anyone learning the game. If you have them in your collection, or if you are an Ariadna player who can proxy them easily, and you are looking for a different experience, and you are looking for something that is maybe a little bit of a challenge, and let's see how you can do with it, or you want to learn and play something that many people will be unfamiliar with and see if you can leverage that, for example, to go, 4-1 or 3-2 in an event despite the fact you're playing USAriadna, there are reasons to play the faction. And with that in mind, let's jump into Infinity Army and look at some of these profiles. So we're going to start as usual with link teams, all of the linkable models. We're going to work through all of those before jumping on into solo operators and talking about them, before looking finally at a sample showcase army that kind of ties together some of the concepts that I have mentioned. And so to begin with, therefore, we have USAriadna Grunts. Now, Grunts can form part of a Heris and a Core. They have armor 3 and shock immunity, and basically nothing else going for them. Technically, that AP sniper rifle is kind of appealing at 0 SWC, but my general rule of thumb is actually to suggest that you probably don't take too many grunts in any individual list. Gone are the days, I think, where a 5-person grunt regiment was something you would actually see in an Ariadnan list. I think in N5 we don't have the luxury of dedicating 5 troops to what is basically purely an ARO piece and which tops out at ballistic skill 12. We can get ballistic skill 12 in plenty of other places in this faction, Lord knows, without dedicating multiple troops worth of link team filler in a relatively static position to get to it. Now, you might find yourself occasionally running maybe a Grunt Haris. Right, there are worse things than a grunt, a 112 who counts as a grunt, and then a gun of some description. That's actually quite a cheap way to force multiply the Unknown Ranger, for example, who is a wildcard and who we will talk about. But that's sort of kind of the limit. Yes, you can take some AP sniper rifles and give them +1 special die, but they are going to get mown down in pretty short order if you use them as reactive pieces, and they are ballistic skill 11 if you use them as active pieces. Generally, I'm going to suggest avoiding more than at most a couple of grunts or grunt equivalent models in a list, and at most use them as force multipliers for other pieces, in particular the Unknown Ranger. Now, that is distinct from having grunt equivalent models in different fire teams, because there are a couple of wild cards that are worth talking about in the context of being grunts. Now, we'll get to those in a second, but just to quickly discuss some of the other profiles that are accessible here to the USAriadna Line Ranger Regiment Grunts. The lieutenant is noteworthy because it is the cheapest lieutenant you have access to in your army. USAriadna is not a faction that really has any lieutenants that it particularly wants to be active, and since it doesn't have any that it wants to be active, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a 10-point lieutenant just in the back, in the rear with the gear, perhaps forming part of a link team that is relatively static. The AP sniper rifle is, as noted, a 0 SWC 18-point gun, although I would encourage you not to take it except in desperation. But we do otherwise have the forward deployment +8-inch grunts, heavy flamethrowers, light shotguns, armor 3. Now, the heavy shotgun and the armor 3 is the big ticket here. You can put these things in kind of forward picket locations, use them to potentially ablate or hold off attacks, where being armor 3 in that kind of position actually is quite meaningful. Having someone come around the corner and point a shotgun at you, responding with a flamethrower, armor 3 gives you a reasonable chance of holding off an attack, particularly with a lighter element, like anything coming at you with chain rifles. You have a 50-50 of surviving and then trying to kill with the flamethrower. But the half an SWC cost on these guys actually is a little bit of an impediment. I have been finding in list construction with USAriadna Ranger Force that no, I actually really need all of my SWC in the faction now. The presence of relatively attractive cheap duo and Haris teams, and the fact that none of my gunfighters are good enough to reliably take gunfights over and over and over, means that I need the redundancy. I need like 4 good heavy weapons in this faction, and that leaves me with relatively limited SWC to throw around on vanity picks. And particularly now that there is a Foxtrot Mine Layer profile that I am probably preferring to take over this grunt forward deployment with half SWC, I am not looking at putting that forward deploying grunt in too many lists. Ultimately, the forward deploying grunt does not meet the litmus test of model that might feasibly be used to attack and win me the game at basically any point. But as far as models go that could potentially roll up their sleeves and go and launch an offense, it is close to being viable. 4-4 move is a change to USAriadna grunts in this edition. They used to be 4-2. And there are worse things than prosecuting an offensive with a model armed with a heavy flamethrower, a light shotgun, and armor 3. But ultimately, I think we are relying in USAriadna on our pieces to be able to do more work than a USAriadna grunt forward deploying. There are other factions in which this would be a fantastic piece. I don't think it's kind of a showcase anymore, even though it used to absolutely be in previous editions of the game. Now, in comparison to the Grunt equivalent wildcards actually are kind of interesting, specifically because there are two of them. The first is the 112 FTO, coming in at only 11 points. It's a doctor with a light shotgun and whip 13. Now, you can't reroll because almost nothing in this faction has cubes. There are like 2 models in the entire faction that has cubes. A 13 to attempt to recover a model is still not the worst thing in the world if you have the order spare. And a willpower 13 specialist that can join links for 11 points, that's fine. That's cheap. That is potentially doing a lot under certain circumstances. Now, the most important thing about the 112 FTO is that it has the Grunt tag for being considered a Grunt in fire teams. That does mean that you can combine it with, say, a Grunt Lieutenant and the Unknown Ranger to get 2 Grunts in a fire team, multiplying the Unknown Ranger with the special die. But the actual really interesting thing is when we combine it with the second wildcard that we have access to. And that is Grunt Intel Rosalind Munro. She also is a wildcard and counts as a Grunt, which means that if you take any fire team that you have access to in USAriadna and you put a 112 and Rosie Munro in the fire team, you now have 2 Grunts in that fire team. And because you have 2 Grunts in that fire team, you get +1 special die. Now, there are only a relatively limited number of things that we're super keen to apply that to, but for example, Blackjacks can be duo linked. That's a little bit awkward, but a Blackjack APHMG with Rosie Munro and a 112 is far from being the worst build your own HRMC that exists in the game. On top of that, if the Blackjack goes down, well, we still have Rosie and the 112 getting duo bonuses, and Rosie's gunfighting is, well, she's ballistic skill 12, but she's going to be packing burst 2+1 with a light rocket launcher, or burst 3+1 with a thunderbolt, depending on what profile you take, and that can get you out of a tight spot if it absolutely has to. She is armor 3, she is dogged, she has forward deployment, she is a specialist, means you get another specialist in that fire team. And finally, she's even potentially a chain of command option, which does have some merit if you are really trying to make full use of all 15 troops in a list. You might consider taking a lieutenant from one of the heavier regiments to form part of a duo, and spending a few extra points on her to have chain of command just for insurance in that case if that link goes aggressive is not the worst thing. Now, are these super powerful in terms of combinations? No, they're not bad, but they help us find edges that we might not otherwise have. And again, if we think about a Haris team of a Blackjack, Rosie, and a 112, that is barely more than 20 points per model on average, and you will get that kind of use out of that fire team. It's pretty sound. Now, from the Grunt fire team, we move into the USAriadna Ranger Force fire team, and this is where we start hitting the heavier stuff, medium and heavy infantry, starting with the Marauders. Now, I am going to genuinely endorse the Marauder, and you know things are a bit grim when I'm endorsing a 20-point non-shock immune ballistic skill 12 trooper, but this is kind of what we've got, and it's these guys that are going to form a significant portion of the list that we will get to at the end of this episode. Now, there are multiple pieces that are relevant here, but all of them should be considered, particularly in the context of duo fire teams. 2 of these guys in a duo is usually going to give you a serviceable and somewhat resilient gunfighter, some serviceable and somewhat resilient close assault, because a rifle, heavy flamethrower, and heavy pistol with +1 special die, armor 3, coming around a corner, staying in cover, and dogged can genuinely prosecute a close assault if it needs to. And all for, again, kind of that 20-ish point price mark. Now, the profiles that we are most interested in here, firstly, are the gunfighting elements, the 2 SWC profiles. Ignore the AP Spitfire. Well, don't ignore it. It actually could be played, but we are particularly interested in the sniper rifle and the heavy rocket launcher. The heavy rocket launcher, because it's the cheapest SWC profile, and it is a +1 burst, multispectral visor 1 HRL. Put that in a duo, and it is rolling 3 dice and 1 special die with a multispectral visor, which means usually it will be rolling for 12s, and especially heavy rocket launchers that can be relied upon to score like a couple of hits in a volley when it wins the face-to-face roll. And at ballistic skill 12 on 4 dice, that's not particularly unreliable. Those continuous damage, cover ignoring templates add up to damage fast. Now, in basically all respects, the heavy rocket launcher is the preferable gunfighting piece here, but we do need to spare some consideration for the sniper rifle. Sniper rifle +1 burst, it is 7 points more expensive than the HRL, despite being, generally speaking, much less dangerous, but Firstly, sniper rifle rangebands are not bad to have, but more importantly, it is half an SWC. This is an SWC constrained faction that is trying to make use of a full 15 troopers in any given list. If we want access to any kind of luxuries in the list, if we want access to mine layers, if we want access to those forward deploying grunts, we need to find the SWC for them, and we can find them by taking a half an SWC sniper as one of our gunfighters. That makes this model actually kind of important, the 30-point Marauder. It is not irrelevant, it will be in lists, because you are basically paying 7 points for a whole SWC, and you can use that on a lot of profiles. The Paramedic is a quite worthwhile specialist. The Lieutenant is a very serviceable Lieutenant. Something like a turn 3-1 run where he and his Marauder buddy, like they move forward, the HRL dies at some point, and he makes an attack with the rifle, heavy flamethrower, and heavy pistol, going dogged and clearing a room. That's fine. 19 points for that capability, not bad at all. Not great, but not bad. We can find some use for that Marauder Lieutenant if we want to, again, if we are trying to make full use of all 15 troopers in a given list. Dogged is fine on these guys, Armor 3 is fine on these guys, having stealth actually is kind of nice, and forward deployment is also an occasionally relevant rule. They're also pretty damn good classified machines because on particularly those HRL models, you have a visor, you have veteran troops, you have medium infantry, and that alone covers off a significant chunk of the classified deck. Add in some doctors or some paramedics, and we are good enough at doing classifieds in this faction. Now, by comparison, the Marauder is the shitty twin of the Minuteman is the shitty twin of the Marauder, but every now and again one of these will unfortunately be necessary. Now, they have a few things that are going for them. 6-2 move is actually kind of nice. And they are also native ballistic skill 13, which is 1 point higher than their Marauder cousins. That's the end of the nice things I have to say about Minutemen, but we only can have access to 5 Marauders and we want to fill 15 Troopers, so we will be using these from time to time. The NCO is also kind of worth pointing out. Now, 33 points for a single wound dude with no visual modifiers. Holy damn, that's expensive, particularly when you consider the fact that this is a heavy infantry, and even though it's not hackable, it is absolutely vulnerable to EM rounds. And as if paying 33 points for a single wound gun wasn't some peasant shit already, the vulnerability to emitters and EM mines just makes it worse. But we can only have 5 Marauders, and we might want to run 3 duos. On top of that, the APHMG does, firstly, it is an APHMG. That is a relatively dangerous gun. You can give it duo bonuses easy, 5 dice downrange on 13s with armor 3 to at least keep you somewhat safe on the rejoinder. That's not the worst thing in the world. It's also an NCO, and this is a faction that is not going to be making use of its lieutenant orders that terribly much. Maybe at the last turn of the game as part of an attack run, if you have taken a Marauder Lieutenant, yes, you can do that, but for turns 1 and 2, having an NCO does genuinely represent an additional order. You can quite easily take a Minuteman in a Grunt fire team, and so that Grunt team of Grunt Lieutenant, 112, and Minuteman, 33 points and half an SWC still isn't great, but that is a viable link setup. Just as a little bit of a somewhat dangerous rampart sweeper, and the fact that the Minuteman can move 6-2 means that having it strafe back and forth in your deployment zone, just using combat group 2 orders, that is in the list that we'll see at the end of this video, I'm running things like Rosie, a 112, and a Blackjack instead, but you could viably replace that with an Ohio Minuteman, a Grunt, and a 112, and you would have a similarly serviceable setup with an extra order but 1 fewer wound because you don't have the resiliency of the Blackjack. Now, there aren't really any other profiles that I particularly recommend here on this guy. When I was going through and doing a review of this faction, doing some list construction, talking to locals who had been playing some USAriadna in N5, I did take a look at the Lieutenant profiles, but by god, 27 points for Lieutenant is not something I'm willing to pay for in this faction. +1 command token is nice, but it's not worth that premium. So stick to the NCO APHMG and basically leave the rest at home. Even then, the APHMG is just a sometimes piece. Now, pairable with the USAriadna Ranger Force fire teams, or as a wildcard generally, we have the Unknown Ranger. Now, this is a gentleman who was one of the best pieces in the game in N4, and is not one of the best pieces in the game in N5. He has suffered quite badly from being nerfed, presumably in response to playtester feedback, who felt that he was a very powerful piece in N4. He went down while the entire rest of the game in his weight class went up, and so he is now, relative to the points cost, playable. He's playable. Now, frankly, I think USAriadna needs access to slightly better than just playable pieces, but I have played against USAriadna. In that game, the Unknown Ranger did some of the best work in the faction, and he should be considered for that reason. He can duo with a single Marauder and get plus martial die that way, pretty reasonable, or as noted, you can chuck him in with a couple of Grunts and get kind of the same effect. Now, notwithstanding that he's been nerfed when maybe perhaps the faction did not need nerfs, coming in at usually it's going to be 46 points and 1 SWC for the most expensive profile is the one that you will want. You do get a fairly solid package. Firstly, it's a 1 SWC gun, which frees up half an SWC for things like mine layers. Secondly, he's nice and fast at 6'2". He has pretty okay close combat. CC23 Martial Arts 1 is kind of bare minimum level stuff. But in a faction with access to pretty reasonable smoke, and he has stealth, and he has tactical awareness, one of the few models, I think he's the only model in the entire faction with tactical awareness, you can actually get in and slit some throats if you absolutely have to, if you're given support by other pieces. He's also a proper multi-wound model with shock and no wound incapacitation with armor 4, which is a pretty big deal. And especially the 46-point profile is a very serviceable gunfighter. Easy access to a 5th dice with an AP Spitfire, ballistic skill 13, that's high watermark in USAriadna, but mimetism and an MSV makes the Unknown Ranger the only model in the entire faction that could be considered a primary gunfighter who has a visual mod. If you want a gun with mimetism, it's this guy. It's the Unknown Ranger. That's it. That's the only option in the entire faction. And while frankly, I would say that he is a bit expensive for what you get in this edition, he is still a very valuable asset, and I would expect to see him in certainly some USAriadna list. You should consider taking him. He is good and he will do work. If you want a carry piece, if you want to play a model that's like, no, I can actually hang my hat on this guy, he will go out and do things, he will punch well on relative to his weight class, then if nothing else, it is not hard to find the points in this faction to afford that single 46 model. He is the most expensive model in the faction by a wide margin, actually, and he mostly does a pretty good job of justifying it. Now, second to last, we have Blackjacks, proper multi-wound models, albeit with Battle Ravage, which drops them down in terms of their armor, their fizz, their ballistic skill at second. It's not the worst transmutation in the game, but losing the ballistic skill is a little bit of a pain. But Armor 5 down to 4 with 2 actual wounds, and relatively heavy firepower. These things are not too bad. They are not, it should be noted, great, because a ballistic skill 13, burst 5, AP HMG is something that you can get in like most factions for about this points cost. But having a Panzerfaust for ARO, which combines very nicely with Special Die if you can get it, and a Heavy Pistol and Chest Mine for close assault, like this is a pretty serviceable element all things considered. It's still pretty budget, but 5 dice on 13s with armor-piercing shots downrange, plus some ARO potential, plus a little bit of close assault potential in a pinch, all things considered, it's not too bad. I would not recommend taking these guys unless you get the duo bonus on them, but you can get the duo bonus as noted, either by just duoing them, or by forming a Blackjack Haris and wildcarding in a 112 FTO and Rosie Monroe, which means your Blackjack Haris now has 2 USAriadna Grunts in it, which means it has 2 troops of the same type, which means it gets a duo bonus. Now, finally, and technically in terms of available fire teams, we have Mavericks. Mavericks can be formed up into a duo or a Haris, and you can consider running these things in a duo. I think the highlight days of N4, where you would occasionally see motorcycle gunfighters because they all had mimetism, but had the ability to be able to take cover thanks to the sort of like slight ITS rule change for motorcycles at the end of the edition, those days are gone. Limited cover is not as bad as no cover, but you are basically a ballistic skill 12 trooper with no modifiers if you are taking gunfights with these guys, because you are just hoping that mimetism applies the same penalty that cover otherwise would. But they do have multispectral visors and ballistic skill 12, and there are some interesting weapon loadouts you have access to here. They all have smoke grenade launchers, which means a pair of these is amongst the most reliable smoke you have access to in the faction, out on long range shots with ballistic skill 12 plus 1 die. And there are probably worse things in the game than a racing close assault with things like the boarding shotgun, the rifle, stuff like that. They're very cheap, right? 16 points for the boarding shotgun smoke grenade launcher, 17 points for the rifle flash pulse forward observer. If you can make an opening with something else or clear the way with smoke, those things can potentially exploit a gap and make a reasonable assault on your opponent's deployment zone. I am not personally reaching for them, But if you can rip around a corner, take a fight where no one has cover, or you're in limited cover and your opponent is not in cover, and you have mimetism, and you are at worst if you take a hit armor 6 because of cover plus armor 3. Right, these are the kind of pieces that are good at breaching a defense that is comprised of stuff like chain rifles. Again, not personally reaching for them, but the duo-linked smoke, if nothing else, is kind of interesting. And especially the cheaper pieces are really coming in cheap. You can usually find some way to fit 16 or 17 point models in a list. Now, with our link teams covered, let's talk about solo operating pieces. And this is going to basically cover the entire rest of the faction in terms of interesting things to talk about, because there's just not that much other stuff to talk about. And so we're going to begin with the airborne pieces, and in particular, Roger Van Zant. Now, for a very long time, Van Zant was the model with Parachutist Deployment Zone. He's not anymore. There are multiple things in the game with that capability, and Roger is frankly not the best of them anymore, but he's not bad. Now, 35 points is pricey, but this is a faction where we can find a way to find those points. Oh boy, can we. And unlike in N4, it's actually not too difficult to conceal the presence of Van Zant. There's a very significant change to the Foxtrot ranges that has happened this edition, where they finally begin to have access to a mine layer profile, which means that we can fill the midfield with enough camouflage markers to make it genuinely dicey for our opponent to guess as to whether we have Van Zant or not. And that's actually pretty useful for making maximal use of a piece like Roger, not just because it means we can conceal him when we do have him, but it means that we can build midfield presences where we don't have Roger, but where the midfield presence kind of alludes to the fact that maybe we do. My opponent can't be sure, that's the important thing. And so when we establish that fog of war, even if we aren't paying 35 points for Mr. Van Zandt, a canny opponent will often still be in a position where they have to at least account for his possibility, which draws defensive elements away from your direction and toward the back table edge where he might come on, which just in small but subtle ways makes the game a bit easier for you. Now, when you do use him, he's pretty solid. He needs to find an opening, he needs to be able to make use of stealth. Usually in an ideal world, he's going to be taking a couple of different attacks. He'll be wanting to do things like put AP rifle shots into the backs of models from outside 8 inches where they don't get AROs. 3 dice on 16s is pretty good at scoring damage. And then he wants to usually sneak in and get melee kills. CC22 Martial Arts Level 2 is good enough to win face-to-face rolls against basically anything in the light or line infantry category. Go slit them throats, get some kills, and then hunker down. Now, if he does have to make a suicide attack, he has Dogged, and he can combine Dogged with a +1 burst chain Colt and either the AP rifle or the AP heavy pistol, meaning worst case scenario, he can force trades. That's the kind of thing you maybe want to change to. If he takes a wound doing something as part of securing an important kill, well, just go Rambo, right? Spend orders making attacks with him, forking the chain Colt and heavy pistol until he kills something and dies in the process. 35 points, it's actually not hugely common in my experience that he will necessarily trade up. 35 points is not cheap for that kind of deployment zone parachutist model. There are models that are cheaper than he are, like a Rassiat, for example, is considerably cheaper than he is. But a Rassiat exists in factions that have a harder time concealing it. Van Zant can be concealed, and you do have the points for him in USAriadna. He is also one of only 2 models with NCO, which means that he's basically most of the time getting an extra free order, which means he's not a huge impost on your order pool. Well, actually, he is still an impost on your order pool. It's going to be very rare that you will begin a turn with Van Zant generating an order for you, but it means that on the turn he makes his Rambo run, he will usually be able to do it with ample orders to spare, often without making a huge impost on the group that he's in. That means you could safely put him in combat group 1, safely put him in combat group 2, he'll have 6 orders or 5 orders to spend the turn he arrives, and generally makes a mess. Now the other thing just to consider in terms of attack patterns with him, good rules of thumb, particularly with deployment bone parachutists, don't feel the need to bring him on turn 1. Often it is much better to let your opponent kind of unpack their list a little bit. They will have to inevitably move pieces forward. They have to do things to accomplish the mission in any mission in Infinity. There will be gunfights. Both players will sustain losses. And so what that means is that the defense that they set up, usually defenses will be strongest immediately after deployment. That is when a player has all of their pieces in place. They are maximally prepared. That is usually not the environment you want to send a parachutist into. Instead, wait for the defenses to fray, wait for gaps to emerge, and then place him to exploit those gaps when they emerge. If you do want to use Roger as a turn 1 attack piece, I actually would probably recommend reaching back for the Maverick duo. Not because I think Mavericks are particularly incredible or because I think they are going to launch an assault alongside him, but because smoke grenade launchers have a 24-inch range. And if you are committed to the idea of bringing Roger on turn 1, you had better have some way to let him land safely and then start getting kills. And smoke from downtown, right? Not taking face-to-face rolls with the smoke grenade launchers, just finding angles with the smoke grenade launchers and hooking those grenades across the battlefield to create safe landing spaces and kill zones for Roger to Pac-Man through close combat with his CC-22 martial arts 2. That is how if I was dedicated to bring him on turn 1, that is what I would do. If not, allow time for your opponent's defenses to kind of like to fray and then bring him in. Now, finally, as noted, you can either go on a Rambo 1 with him or seriously do give consideration to getting 1 or 2 kills and then hunkering back. Killing Roger in ARO can actually be quite difficult, especially if he goes into suppressive fire. And if you find just like a safe spot to tuck him, like if you just kill all of the things in a little section of your opponent's DZ and then hunker down there, it is often going to create a situation where they then have to reroute resources that they have previously pushed forward. They have to start rerouting those backwards, which means that the early part of the game creates space for Roger to arrive, and then Roger's arrival gets a few kills, hunkers down, creates space for the rest of your force because your opponent is pulled back to their deployment zone. Now, those are kind of idealized operations, but if you're thinking about what the best possible outcomes with Roger look like, that's kind of what I would be pointing you toward. Now, our 2nd Airborne Regiment, and yet eminently serviceable, is the 6th Airborne Rangers Regiment. Now, these guys are fundamentally nothing much special, but they are not expensive, and they are martial arts 2 APCCW CC-22 parachutists, and that's kind of cool, particularly given that they have stealth. Now, the damage of the APCCWs is not great. APCCW Power and Strength 7 really can take a couple of stabs to bring even a line infantryman down. A Fusilier, for example, is rolling 8s to save, which is a 40% chance. And so you're actually hoping to crit a fair bit, which is only going to happen about 1 in 3 times. But fundamentally, these are relatively cheap parachutists. 20 points for a forward observer, specialist, flash pulse, decharges, submachine gun. That's basically fine. Can do some mission stuff. Can shoot some people, can stab some people. I'm not reaching for these things terribly often. I'm particularly not reaching for the AP Spitfire. As much as the dream of like on turn 2 turning up and AP Spitfiring something in the back is, 31 points is just a little bit too expensive, I think, to have off the board most of the time. But these are an easy splash in most missions, in most lists. You will, again, much like, say, the Mavericks, you can find 20 points in any given list in USAriadna. If you want to experiment with these, it's not bad. And probably their most useful thing is, yeah, if you do have an Airborne Ranger in your list, and your opponent looks at your list and goes, well, we've played a couple of times in the past, and you've been using Van Zandt, and there's a similar number of camouflage markers, so I'm just going to deploy as though Van Zandt exists, and then, nope, I've just got an Airborne Ranger for some, like, it's a cheaper element in the list, it's easier to include, it's got much less of a demand on it in terms of what it has to accomplish, but your opponent goes ahead and defends against a deployment zone parachutist. Van Zandt's presence kind of makes the Airborne Rangers better. Again, very much a sometimes piece in certain lists. Do not spam them, do not ever take more than 1 would be my advice, and even then only in some lists, but certainly playable, and they fit into that category of things you can get for 20 points, which can absolutely accomplish significant things in a game, and that is Ariadna, but particularly USAriadna's wheelhouse. From here, we get into our camouflaged and infiltration models, and there are actually, even though there are only 3 regiments, there are actually some pretty solid options here. And the Foxtrot Newport Rangers are one of those solid options. Now, there are 2.5 profiles that we are interested in here. We do not care about the sniper rifle, we do not care about the base profile. If we are playing these guys, we are playing usually either a mixture of the forward observer and mine layer, or both. And the mine layer profile in particular is a massive boon to USAriadna in this edition. Now, the mine layer is so important because it lets us build a camouflage shell game that is actually meaningful. Before N5, it was not possible to have deployed mines as part of an USAriadna camouflage mix. Now it is. Because we can have mines, our opponent now no longer gets to know that every single camouflage marker we have is either a troop that can be killed or a decoy. Now, It can be a troop that can be killed, or a decoy, or a mine that can hurt our opponent, and that makes a really significant difference. The presence of the mine layer also means that it's on a regular troop. Hard cases, which we'll talk about soon, are irregular. We can have more camouflage markers without hurting our irregular troop count without straining our command tokens, and that's very significant. Like the mine layer Foxtrot is the biggest addition to USAriadna in N5 by a wide margin. In fact, I think it's probably the only really significant new profile, but whatever. And you should seriously be looking at running these in most lists. Even in situations where there is an exclusion zone, the fact that these guys can hard roll to over-infiltrate on 10s with a 50% chance is not the worst thing in the world. In fact, even if you're playing in stuff like Panic Room, where there is a confused deployment, take a bunch of these. Okay, we rolled some 10s and some we didn't. If you take, say, 4 or 5 models that can over-infiltrate or that can roll to confuse to deploy in Panic Room on 10s, you're gonna succeed with a couple, mathematically speaking. Now, complementing the Foxtrots, we have a couple of units, hard cases and beast hunters. Hard cases used to be very important because they were the only way to get extra camouflage markers beyond things that were actually troopers in USAriadna. That is no longer the case with the Foxtrot mine layer, but we can still occasionally look to hardcase frontiersmen if we are really looking to cheap out as part of a camo game. Now, frankly, Foxtrots are AVA4, and you have Beast Hunters as well, which means that in N5 I am really not reaching for hard cases all that often, particularly now that light shotguns are no longer template weapons and they don't have access to a boarding shotgun. These are the least necessary part of your camouflage mix, but if you want just 2 more camouflage markers for the price of 1 troop slot, because you really have a plan that relies on that shell game, there are worse things than reaching for the 12-point light shotgun hardcase frontiersman. Not, I would say, going to make an appearance in particularly many USAriadna lists now that the Foxtrot mine layer exists, but it's an element that is worth remembering exists just for those occasional more extreme list cases. Finally, in terms of the camouflage elements, we have the Beast Hunters Free Guild, and here in particular we have the Ariadne Unique Beast Hunter Free Guild, the 17.1. This is one of my 2 favorite Beast Hunters. Right? The 3 best in the game are the Panashanian one with the burst +1 heavy flamethrower, the Yuching one with the extra close combat, and then the Ariadne one is probably my personal favorite with the burst 3 heavy pistol. That heavy pistol is at burst 3, I mean it's only ballistic skill 11, but it has mimetism -3. Coupled with super jump and surprise attack, etc., that's actually capable of winning face-to-face rolls, or just taking face-to-face rolls against dodges when your opponent's trying to dodge the heavy flamethrower, and is a significantly superior sidearm to literally everything else Beast Hunters have. Every other Beast Hunter, if it's trying to fork a face-to-face roll, is hoping to do so with the heavy flamethrower and the close combat. And Beast Hunter close combat is actually not good enough to fight its way through a sustained close combat. It is just CC21 with no modifiers, maybe other than surprise. But 3 dice on 11s with mimetism from cover with a heavy pistol is actually just an eminently serviceable gunfighting element. Like if you absolutely have to and you are within 8 inches, you will kill things just with that heavy pistol. And that means that the Beast Hunter can use all of its mobility, it can use a template weapon, it can use the mines, the Panzerfaust and ARO if it have to, but its offensive options actually include, I will shoot you. And that is something that Beast Hunters otherwise don't have access to, and in combination with the mobility of the Beast Hunter, thanks to Super Jump, I actually think it's a very useful part of the camouflage force mix in USAriadna. Basically, in any situation where you are running a couple of Foxtrots, possibly including a mine layer, that's the point where you start going, can I afford another irregular in this list? If so, the answer will not always be yes, but if so, that's the point where we go, yep, Beast Hunter, slam that one in as well, and add this extra very dangerous element into our camouflage markers. Now, the reason why you may not have space for more irregulars in a list to include the Beast Hunter is because of the assault elements in USAriadna. And these are actually genuinely pretty good. Like, you can't really ask for much better relative to the price you are paying, and that starts with Desperados coming in at an extremely affordable 7 points. Now, yes, these have technically been better at different points in the game. Yes, at the end of N4, these were even stronger, but it doesn't matter. Evaluated on their own principles, the 7-point assault pistol +1 burst Desperado it's just a good piece. It's a good piece capable of doing significant damage to your opponent. The worst case scenario for this Desperado is that it is 7 points in a chain rifle defense and maybe moves out later in the game. But Much more likely is that at some point it finds a window where something throws smoke, maybe another Desperado, it can impetuous forward, and then it moves very, very quickly towards your opponent's DZ and comes around a corner and takes face-to-face rolls, right? That's the important thing about this Desperado. Yes, it has a chain rifle, technically speaking, that might incent your opponent to dodge, but this guy is ballistic skill 11 with mimetism, usually taking gunfights in positions where no one has cover, and is rolling 5 dice at close range. Generally, that means it's rolling 5 dice on 14s coming around a corner, which means it just shoots things and wins face-to-face rolls. It wins face-to-face rolls, it kills things, and it moves on, which is important because the Desperado otherwise does not have any like dogged or no wounding cap. But if a Desperado connects with your opponent's deployment zone, it is one of the best pieces in the entire game in that like 6 to 8 point irregular category for actually having a shot at multiplicatively paying for itself, right? Things like a Shaolin Monk is usually quite good at getting one very solid kill in close combat. The Desperado is one of the best pieces in the game at going, yep, winning a face-to-face roll against you, you're dead. 8 inches, winning a face-to-face roll against you, you're dead. Move 8 inches, win a face-to-face roll against you, you're dead. If it gets to that deployment zone connection, or gets to pick things apart when they are isolated, very, very strong. And it's really one of the last true very cheap irregular models that can actually go on a tear because of its ability to just win face-to-face rolls off of usually 5 dice on 14s. Now, I would not necessarily say that every single USAriadna list should include multiple Desperados, but you absolutely could, and the list we'll see at the end of this video has 2 of them for that reason. Now, the other very good irregular piece in USAriadna that might edge out Beast Hunters is the Devil Dog. It's the model where you have a dog for your dog. The Devil Dog, particularly with the Canine Antipode team, my preferred profile is the second cheapest one, the 22-point profile. Despite everything, some changes to how immunity, total immunity worked, it's now got immunity enhanced. It is overall, I would say, probably in the best spot that it has ever been. There have been some mild tweaks in terms of things like ballistic skill and CC score that put it basically just in a very sound position for rapid offensive unit, main battle warband, whatever you want to call it. It's a very good example of one of those pieces. 6'4", 6'6" on the K9, 3 wounds worth of models. Those are tied, yes, to the Devil Dog, but the Devil Dog has immunity armor, 2 wounds, armor 4, and BTS 3, which is rare on an Antipode style unit. Both of them have super jump, which means they are moving very quickly in N5, 8 inches on the first skill. You are throwing smoke on 16s, and you even have a very serviceable ranged fork because you have the chain rifle. Yes, it's just burst 1, but you have the chain rifle, and then if your opponent dodges, you have a ballistic skill 11 AP heavy pistol that is actually just capable of doing damage. As you close in, you can threaten with that, and that is something that the Devil Dog didn't used to be able to do, but it benefits a lot from in N5. And then finally, in close combat, although the Devil Dog doesn't have any CC additional skills, it has the best close combat skill, which is this unit is comprised of multiple models thanks to having a peripheral, and those are both very dangerous, which means you get to actually have kind of true Berserk style effects, where you get to choose to just not make a face-to-face roll if you don't want to. When you get both of these into close combat, because of how the peripheral rules work, after your opponent AROs, you will pick one of your models to actually make the attack. That means that if your opponent attacks the Canine Antipode, the Devil Dog can make the CC attack, and 2 dice on 23s with an PS4 APCCW is very dangerous. Or if your opponent attacks the Devil Dog, you can just roll 2 dice with the Antipode, 2 dice on 20s with a PS5 APCCW. Again, not opposed. That is usually going to do 2 wounds to most things, which means that the Devil Dog and the K9 are very good at getting secured kills your opponent can't avoid. Or, if your opponent CCs against the Devil Dog, you just take the fight, because it's 2 dice on 23s, which is very likely to win face-to-face rolls. Coupled with the Devil Dog's durability, at least one of these is a very good choice basically in any USAriadna list. It can be a little tricky to find space for multiples just because we also want Desperados, and we can only take so many irregulars before it begins to get awkward. We like a Beast Hunter as well. It's very easy to start edging into a position where you have 5 irregulars in a list, and managing 5 irregulars over a long game is very difficult. But even if you have like just the one Devil Dog, you can rely on it usually to position at some point during the game, and then launch an attack that gets a secured and important kill. It's just very, very useful. And the absolute lowest bar for these guys is that they are 3 wounds worth of deployment zone defense that takes ages for your opponent to get through. You've even got a sensor on the Canine Antipode, which can be just very useful. well. If your opponent is running like lots of shell game stuff, there are certainly U-chain lists these days, for example, that run lots and lots of camouflage markers. You can just casually clear out all of them, see what everything is, kill what you want to, go hunting. Just a genuinely very good state. Super, super useful unit. And once again, 22 points, right there in that band where you can have 15 models in a list very easily, all of which are capable of carrying a game, and the Devil Dog is one of the best ones of those. If you have USAriadna, you should have at least one of these. And frankly, after all of the various tweaks and changes to this style of unit in Ariadna, I would go as far as to say that there's a pretty good chance that the Devil Dog is best in class for this style of main battle warband, and that is already a strong and powerful class of unit, even in Infinity N5. Now, normally this would be the part of the video where I mention some things that you might want to try that you wouldn't normally, but this is USAriadna and there's only 21 troops in the entire faction, so let me just very, very quickly mention the couple of things I haven't already. War drivers. If there was any network projection or even just defensive network stuff in this faction at all, this would be an incredible profile. There are factions that would kill for a 14.6 cents normal hacker with 0 pain. But USAriadna is not one of those factions. You can take this guy in some of those scenarios where it's just really, really useful or important to have a hacker. Countermeasures, certainly highly classified. God help you if you're playing this faction in highly classified, but that's an example. Not something I would reach for in many cases just because it's so hard to capitalize, but hey, particularly in the end of the current ITS season, where many factions have access to a bit more stealth than they normally would, a 6th Sense hacker would be really, really good if there was anything resembling a network. Frankly, all it would take for these guys to be absolutely perfect is mine layer and a deployable repeater. Like, genuinely, if you just add that profile, right? 1 SWC, 16 points, mine layer, deployable repeater, and this hacking profile, all of a sudden Ariadna has a hacking defense. Corvus Belli, if you're listening, you're not, but still. But between now and then, it's a specialist in some scenarios where it's very important to have a hacker. And then finally, just to round things out and keep this video going for very slightly longer, Wild Bill, Legendary Gunslinger. Don't personally like him for reasons I can't fully articulate, mostly because if you want to do anything with this guy, you're trying to do so with those pistols usually at 8 inches, and that's a real thing to be. And the only links that he can join are grunt links, so you have to tie him to a grunt or 2 if you want to get the SD bonuses. He doesn't count as a grunt, so you need 2 of them. And yes, theoretically, if you were really scraping, you could take a Grunt, a 112, and Wild Bill, and that would not be the worst fire team in the game, but the problem with it is that it operates under much more limited conditions. It is really only good, like, you can fire that rifle of his if you have to. It is a damage 6 rifle. Hooray, you could fire that at 16 inches with 3 dice on 16s, but really if you want armor-piercing rounds, looking at getting in range with those multi-pistols, and once you're trying to get in range with those multi-pistols, you have a fire team that has constrained itself to the 8-inch range band. Don't do that. I don't personally see a use case for this guy in most lists, but hey, we can afford 24-point models in this faction. There might be a list somewhere that uses him. And that, finally, brings us to our sample list for USAriadna. Is this the worst list name I've ever written? Please tell me in the comments. Now, this is a list that is trading very heavily on a lot of the principles that we've covered over the course of this video. We are making extensive use of duos and small fire teams. In fact, I think it's just all duos and a Haris, and assault elements that can potentially carry the game themselves. Finally, every single model in this entire list is trying to do something important. There are no cheerleaders. This is a 15 model worth of potentially active trooper list, meaning that unless we are in retreat, there is something we can potentially do to influence the game state. I think you have to play or want to play USAriadna that way, and it is one of the few things that sets USAriadna apart in N5. There are lots of factions that can have lots of active elements. There are not many factions that can actually truly hit the there are 15 pieces in here that I can use to win the game style, and that's pretty significant. So what do we have? So the first thing we have is we have 4 Marauders and a Minuteman running in a mix of SWC weapons and shorter range pieces that I expect you to generally run as 2 duos, but you can, if you need to, run as a 4-person core and get that sweet, sweet +1 ballistic skill. So we have 2 heavy rocket launchers, right? Marauder MSV1, heavy rocket launcher +1 burst, each of them paired with, in one case, a Marauder paramedic, in the other case, a Minuteman forward observer. Now, I don't love the Minuteman Forward Observer. I would prefer very slightly that that be another Marauder Paramedic, for example, but we can only have 5 Marauders in a list, and we are at a VA cap, so a Minuteman it is. And look, he's not the worst thing in the world. He is +1 ballistic skill, he is 6-2 move, and the 6-2 move on a model that might be ranging ahead, taking more close range gunfights, right? Rather than a heavy flamethrower, he has a light flamethrower +1 burst, which is actually genuinely better. It's not a terrible enough comparison between the Minuteman FO and the Marauder Paramedic to feel super bad about it, and I needed something that counted as a USRF. So 2 duos, potentially a 4-person core, but realistically 2 duos. We then have Haris. This is the Haris I mentioned with the Blackjack, where it's a Blackjack, Chain of Command Rosie, and a 112 FTO. Now, as mentioned, it would be very easy to adjust this to maybe have a Minuteman NCO APHMG. In that situation, that would just become a Grunt link. In that situation, you won't have the extra wound on the Blackjack. It'll be fundamentally the same gunfighter, right? Armor piercing, heavy machine gun, ballistic skill 13, 5 dice. But you won't have the extra wound, you will have the NCO. At swings and roundabouts there, I kind of think the Blackjack is an iconic model, and I think it's cool to use it if you can. And a bit of Chain of Command, Rosie, the 112 FTO, kind of just fit together a little bit better for me, so we have this Haris team. We then have 1 Foxtrot main layer, there will be more to come, a Devil Dog with Canine Antipode, again the 22-point profile, the better of the 2 profiles, and the first of 2 Desperados. So in this list, we have 2 duos, just in the first combat group, 2 duos, a 3-person Haris, a mine layer putting out 2 camouflage markers. It is going to be obvious that they're mines, but it's kind of face up a little bit in this case anyway. I just wanted the order mix that way. And then 2 irregular assault elements, which can either be flung forward or just position themselves. You might go on a tear with a Desperado, or you might just throw some smoke. The important thing as well, we'll see a Desperado in combat group 2. Desperados are kind of flexible. They are fast enough that they can potentially launch attack runs from smaller groups, but they're also nice to have in larger groups. So 2 of our irregular assault elements are here. Then in combat group 2, we have an MSV1 Sniper +1 Burst Marauder. Now, this Marauder is present for the reasons I mentioned when talking about the Marauders. We want to have 4 big guns in this list because none of them are good enough to bank the entire game on. But we can have 4 big guns because everything is cheap enough. We just need one of them to be a slightly cheaper SWC, and so we have the Marauder MSV1. It's going to be rolling 4 dice. It has an MSV1. Yes, it's only ballistic skill 12, but 4 dice is 4 dice, and it's armor 3 and dogged. Sniper Rifle is in group 2 because much more often this is going to be the duo that is hanging back, playing very long range fire support. This is among other reasons because it has the Marauder Lieutenant in it, and I don't want him going active and doing any work until late in the game. We do have Chain of Command as insurance because we could afford it, because everything is cheap, but we don't want to throw that Marauder Lieutenant away. We want him to be maybe a turn 3 kind of attack piece with the rifle and the heavy flamethrower when he becomes expendable. We then have 2 Foxtrots, a Forward Observer and a Mine Layer. In scenarios where you did not need a specialist, you could consider replacing the Forward Observer Foxtrot for a Beast Hunter. That would carry you up to 4 irregular troops, which in my experience is the point where it becomes difficult to manage. You begin to impinge a little bit on your order pools. Often later in the game, you will be struggling just a bit to have things really be fully effective. You'll run out of command tokens, etc., but you could do that, or you could dig around and find some points to upgrade the second Desperado into a Beast Hunter. That would be totally workable as well. A bit tricky to find a full 10 points in this list, but I suspect, especially if we turned the Blackjack into a Minuteman and then had just like a couple of grunts, like a Grunt Lieutenant and a 112 FDO, for example, at that point we would have the points to turn the Desperado into a Beast Hunter just for a slightly different mix. But overall, what we have here are 3 duos, all of which can fight a Haris. Like every one of these duos and Haris teams, of which there are 4, has a serviceable, large, dangerous, long-range weapon. And we have 3 solid midfield elements throwing out 5 camouflage markers. And we have 3 assault elements, and we have as good a mix of specialists as you can get in Ariadna. This list has a paramedic, a forward observer, a chain of command, a doctor, and another forward observer, which means you should, for most scenarios, have an ample specialist count, and in a pinch you could even do something like play countermeasures with this list because of that mix. Now, I'm not going to say it's necessarily ideal, but it is trading as best as I can make it on all of the tools I think that USAriadna has, especially the ones that set it a little bit apart, and that's kind of cool and interesting. Now, that wraps up this video for today. Hope very much that you've enjoyed this. As a reminder, if you feel like supporting the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I take requests for video topics, battle reports, etc. from channel supporters, one of whom was Jacob Hawkins, who requested this video. Again, Jacob, thank you very much. Otherwise, the usual YouTube stuff. If you like this video, hit like. If you want to subscribe to the channel, hit the subscribe button. And otherwise, and as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.